Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me in the locker room for an author's afternoon. Joining me are three women with three unique voices and stories to share. All three books were released in the fall in the United States in 2020, and I'm excited to share these stories with you and meet these three authors. My first guest is author Molly Merriman, who has a PhD and is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality and associate professor at Kent State University. She has produced and directed 9 documentaries that have been broadcast and screened in both the United States and the United Kingdom. She is the author of Clipped Wings, The Rise and Fall of the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II, and is currently serving as the historical research producer for the upcoming Red Door Films documentary about the WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots, coming home, fight for a legacy. Please welcome to the locker room, Dr. Molly Merriman. Hi there.
Hi, Ellen. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for being here. What an interesting story. And it's interesting that today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So speaking of World War II, why don't you tell me about the story? Where did you first hear about the WASPs and what drew you to them? Drew you to the story?
Yeah. It's a great question because I think, sadly, not many people know that there were women who flew military planes for the United States during World War II, which significantly helped with the war effort, including the fight against the genocide committing against not only Jewish individuals, but also LGBT individuals and others that were caught up in the Holocaust. And I actually had first heard about the WASP from my parents. My parents were World War II generation. My dad actually was a B-25 mechanic that served in China. And when I was a little girl, I used to say, oh, I want to be a pilot. And my parents had said, well, you can't be right now. But back in World War II, there were women who flew. And I could never find anything about them. They were not part of the story that was told about World War II. And then when I started to look into it, what I realized was that this was a group of women who had valiantly served their country. A number of them actually died in air crashes while they were serving our country. And they ended up being really caught up in a political fight and had Congress actually disband them before the war was over. And as a consequence, they didn't get the military benefits that they were promised. They weren't able to claim veteran status. And then their story returns in the 1970s when women once again are trying to be able to be military pilots. And so, so for my book, what I really focused on was, why was it? If these women were serving and were recognized within the Army Air Forces as doing a good job, why weren't they militarized? And so not only is it a story about the WASP, but it's a story that explains cultural practices and political practices that sadly to this day continue to, keep many of us from having our rights.
It's crazy. So they lost their benefits at that time, even after serving in World War II.
Yes. And so what happened, which was I guess one of the complexities of World War II, is that when we entered the war, we were isolationists and we really did not have a strong military. We really weren't prepared for entering the war. And at the time that the war begins, women are not allowed to serve in any of the branches. So consequently, what happens is each of the military branches separately goes to Congress and says, hey, we need women. We need all the hands on deck that we can have. And would you militarize? And in most of the cases, the bills were basically saying during the interim. So sort of like, yeah, you can help fight the war, but as soon as the war is over, you're out. And so they were having these bills go forward. And in the case of the WASP, I think the real challenge when their bill came forward was that um, they were doing something that was regarded as, very masculine, flying planes, and like, for example, when the Women's Army Corps bill went forward to Congress, they, even though these women were mechanics, they were, driving jeeps and trucks and doing a lot of missions. What the Army said was, "Hey, don't you need a woman's touch? Isn't it nice to have a woman's voice on the phone?" And so we could have these women typing and answering phones and doing all that. And so Congress was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, sure." Well, when the Women's Air Force Service Pilot bill came through, they weren't doing any auxiliary work. They were pilots. And so there was no way that the Army Air Forces could say, "Hey, don't we like ladies to do this work?" And so Congress really was like, "Well, we don't." There were members of Congress on the floor of Congress said, "I don't let my wife drive. Why are we letting them fly planes?" And yeah, as a consequence, the Congress decided to disband them. They were sent home without benefits. When you think about the economic improvements we had from the GI Bill with education, housing, all of those things that were bundled in, they didn't get any of that.
Wow. So when were they banned? Was it after?
It was actually 1944, and so the program started in 1942, and as was the case with all of these, they were called auxiliaries. The military started them and then went to Congress and said militarize them. So these women were wearing uniforms. They were, there was they could have been court-martialed if they violated rules. They were acting as though they were in the military, and the members of the Army Air Force that they reported to treated them as though they were members of the military. And then when Congress, basically was expected to rubber stamp the bill, not only did they not do it, but they said, "We actually don't think these women should be doing this at all. So we're effectively cutting off, their funding." And so in 1944, it was December of 1944. And remember, the war keeps going until August of 45. So when there still was a wartime need, when they were still, engaged in vital missions, they were sent home.
And they basically were able to fly for 2 years from 42 to 44. And then not again until the 70s. Is that what you said earlier?
Yeah, not again until the 1970s. And now, interestingly enough, what happens in the 1970s was there was women pilots who were petitioning the Air Force Academy to be allowed to fly, because one of the impacts of this bill was that Congress also said, "You know what? We just don't think women should be flying military planes, period." And so when the military began to expand roles to women, starting in 1949, as part of the desegregation and opening up of the military, women were forbidden from flying. Well, in the 1970s, women are like, "You know what? We're pushing, we're trying to push through ERA that never succeeded.
Mhm.
We're trying to, become more equal, and we're forbidden." And so at this point, a lot of the WASPs came forward and testified before Congress, really advocated on behalf of these women. And as a consequence, the issue of their militarization came around again. And there was then a bill in the 1970s that retroactively gave the WASP veteran status. It still was contested. They still had to fight members of Congress. But finally, in the 1970s, they were given veteran status. However, by that time, they'd already missed out on the GI Bill. They'd already missed out of careers of being pilots, and so it was in many ways too late for them. But it did matter in terms of their legacy.
I mean, it's a large subject because it's so long ago. So what was your first step in, where was the first place you went to sort of research this?
One of the first things I did was actually meet up with some WASP veterans,
Right.
and as you mentioned, I'm also a filmmaker, and so myself and a friend of mine were looking to make a film on the WASP, and we ended up making just a short film, and then now we're returning back, to doing a much more comprehensive film treatment with the Red Door Films crew. But we met up with some of the women, and one of the things we realized was they didn't really know why things went badly. Because if you think about it, at the time, they're involved in the war effort.
Right.
They're not paying attention to what's happening in Congress, and some of them wondered, did the Air Force sell us out? Did what really went wrong? And around the time that I was doing this research, the the book that came out in the fall is a classics re-release of my original book, so it's got some updated material in it.
Mm-hmm.
Originally, I was doing this research in the 1990s, and President Bill Clinton had declassified a bunch of World War II documents, and so for the first time, scholars, including myself, were able to really dig into the military reports. For a lot of their,
Even the
yeah,
WASPs
yeah,
were, I mean, if he declassified, if President Clinton declassified, they were probably reading a lot of this stuff for the first time.
they were, and yeah,
Fascinating.
and so like a lot of the reports about their service, they had never seen, and so they didn't know, like at the base that I was at, what did they think of me? Did they assess me well? And so all of this came open, and what I was able to demonstrate was that their records were good. The Army Air Force very much wanted them. There were memos that were issued in the Air Force where they were saying, look, if you shut this program down, it's going to interfere with the progress of the war, because unlike the male pilots, these women could fly anything. And one of their primary missions was to fly these airplanes from factory to bases. And so they could fly fighter planes, they could fly bombers, they could fly transport planes. Men were trained to fly one thing. And so what the Army Air Force was saying was, if you shut this program down, we're not going to have anyone to fly these planes. And that was true. And they ended up not having the planes they needed in 1945 because there was this backlog of planes at the factories.
It's really crazy. Like they hurt themselves by doing that. Like you just said, the women could fly anything. They hurt the program by, not allowing them to fly. The documentary you're working on with Red Door Films, is it based on your book?
It's yeah, they are using my book as source material, and then what the crew has been doing is reaching out to surviving veterans. They've been working on this film for about 10 years now,
Oh, wow.
and they've spoken with a range of WASP veterans, as well as contemporary pilots, because when you talk to military pilots, they all know about the WASP. That's the WASP and the Tuskegee Airmen are very
Infamous.
well respected in the military.
Wow. And there's a campaign to help raise money for the documentary, right? That's what this link is for.
Yes. We're very happy to have anyone who can contribute anything at any level to help. It's an independent production, and particularly in a year of COVID, we're not able to do the kind of fundraising events and other activities that's needed. So we really are looking for support to get this film out there.
Are there many of the WASPs still alive today?
No, just like with the rest of World War II veterans, we've been losing them substantially for quite a few years, and there's still a couple, and they're in their late 90s, and older. One of the things about the WASP was that to become a WASP, they already had to be pilots, and so these women tended to already be in their 20s. So you still
they had
see
to
some.
learn how to fly before you were able to do. You weren't trained in the military.
Yeah, yeah, and that's different from the men. Men basically had to be 18 years of age, have good eyesight, uh, be able to read, and have reasonable physical abilities, and the military would train them to be pilots. With the WASP program, they already had to be licensed pilots. They had to have a significant amount of flight hours, so they couldn't just get their pilot's license and go and sign up. And then the training that they got from the military was essentially learning how to adapt to all these different kinds of planes, so single engine planes, double engine planes, four engine planes. And at certain stages of the WASP program, here in Ohio, where I am, is Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And there actually were WASP involved in some of the initial testing of jet aircraft.
Interesting. The WASPs who in 45 were kicked out of the program, did they fly again at some point? Like, what did they end up doing?
Sadly, another repercussion of what happened was that most of them were not even able to fly commercial aircraft anymore, because if you imagine the wars ending, and we're then reopening commercial airliners, and they wanted to hire veterans, and there were all of these men returning, and so airliners would hire veterans, and because of how they ended, they weren't given documentation. Like, if you think about it, when you leave the military, you get certificates, honorable discharge, and then you get letters that say, here's what you were certified to do. Well, because they were just unceremoniously ended, they didn't get any of that documentation. So they would go to airliners and say, yeah, I flew this and this and this and this, and the owners of the airliners would be like, no, you didn't. Women didn't do that. And where's your documentation? And they didn't have any. So very few were able to fly, and so a lot of them, they basically just started families, and there weren't many opportunities for women, because at the same time that this was happening to them, women who'd worked in factories were getting fired so that men could have those jobs back. Like, discrimination was allowed then.
Right.
And so there just weren't jobs for women.
Sadly, it was allowed.
Yeah.
Sadly. Well, I have you for a short time, and I definitely want to talk about, because you were one of a group of faculty who in 2001 started the first LGBT studies program in Ohio, and you also played a key role in the development of Kent State University's LGBTQ Center,
Yes.
which is the new Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. Where did your interest in LGBTQ studies and gender and sexuality begin?
Well, I think, probably it began with me. I identify as a queer woman, and I think that, when I was in graduate school, there weren't programs like this. And so, a lot of my research, a lot of my teaching was, focused on these topics. And I began to be aware that there were starting to be programs of LGBT studies, not in Ohio, but elsewhere. And so I connected with people in New York City. There's the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies, and we were able to share curriculum, and then we made a proposal and got our program up and running. And it really has been a very meaningful program. We have strong enrollments. I think particularly now in a time of COVID, our classes are often the only sense of LGBTQ community that some of our students have. We're one of the few programs in the country that have a transgender studies course, which is, I think, really vital. And it's I think people don't often think about, Kent State University and Ohio as being a place where this might be vibrant, but but it is, and it's a strong program here.
That's fascinating. And the military ban that was just lifted, thanks to President Biden, is a step in the right direction.
It really is, and we have
it's sort of like it's sort of like you're talking about the same thing. I mean, here are people who want to serve our country.
Yes.
And they weren't allowed.
Yeah, and you see this, at the end of World War II, there were lesbian and gay service members who were unceremoniously, dishonorably discharged. So it was known they were gay during the war, but once the war was over, it was like, well, goodbye. And that was a long fight to get recognition. And so
really long.
Yeah, shamefully long. And and it took the Obama administration to finally, open up to service members. And then, unfortunately, Trump literally in a tweet, stopped the service. And we actually have a student at Kent State, Nick Talbot, who's there's a New York Times article. He's been featured several times. He's been one of the people in the lawsuit that has been slowly progressing to try to overturn the transgender ban. And he was in the ROTC, and for for universities like Kent State, where we have a lot of students who are working class and poor, often ROTC scholarships are the way to get a college education. And Nick was midway through his college career when he got kicked out, and the government told him he had to pay back all his money. So not only did they say you're gone, but they were like, you owe us. And it created a real problem for him with financial aid. And it was just a real struggle. And so these actions have consequences that go, far beyond, what people may think they have.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. You said something earlier about graduate school, like they didn't have a program in graduate school. I mean, I identify as gay, and I mean, there was nothing when I, was in college. I mean, I basically really didn't come out till I was out of college, because the time was so different. Mm-hmm. It really moves me a lot, having grown up in a time where I couldn't do that. I mean, my mom has always, had always known and supported me. My dad sadly didn't know before he died, and we're not 100% sure what his reaction would have been, but he was 10 years older. But the being able to see these things now, to have, if my college had an LGBTQ center, would have I mean, I can't even imagine. I probably would have, snuck in there, but
yeah, it really, it saves lives. It saves lives, yeah. And it also expands lives, because I'm sure, Ellen, it was the case for you like it was for me. When you don't see yourself represented, you lose confidence, and you don't realize you have worth. And I think these programs really improve the self-worth of people, as well as serving an educational purpose.
Correct. Yeah, it really does. So you've produced 9 or so documentaries?
Yes.
Can you tell me about some of them?
Yeah, well, they've been on a range of topics. Generally it has been subjects related to gender, race, or sexual orientation. I've, some of my more recent films, I did a film called Red Umbrella Rights that looked at sex worker rights and focused on a group of sex worker activists in San Francisco who are working to end violence against sex workers. And that film was just a lot of fun to make, because these were just such vibrant, engaged activists, and often sex worker activists have to sort of hide in the shadows because of criminalization. But in San Francisco, they were able to have a really good, vibrant community. I've done some work on prison reentry. I did a film called Returning to Life. And if people want to check out my films, if you go to Vimeo and search for my name, you can you can find
Vimeo.com and then search for Molly Merriman.
Yeah. And so I've looked at prison reentry programs. More recently, I've been doing work with Queer Britain, which is the United Kingdom's national LGBTQ museum. And I've been doing oral history-based documentaries that are really telling life stories, and that work you can find on Queer Britain as well as my Vimeo site.
How did you get involved with a museum all the way over there?
I know. It's wonderful. Well,
and living in Ohio.
Yeah. Well, in the good old days when you could travel, I was at an LGBT studies conference in, I think that one was in Liverpool. Yeah. I was in Liverpool, England. And there was a dinner, and as it happened, right across the table from me was Joe Galliano, who was starting this new museum. And he and I got talking, and we realized that we both had this key interest in using video to tell life stories. And so I was like, oh yeah, I'll send you some stuff and help you get started. I did not think for a second that he was going to be like, hey, join us. Because I was like, oh, there'll be some people.
Here's a job.
Yeah. And instead he was like, I really want you to, to be more involved with us. So
we have someone watching too from Columbus, Ohio. Hi, Bessie. Let me just ask before I let you go. LGBTQ studies at Kent State. I grew up in New Jersey, but lived very close to New York City and worked most of my life in New York City. So it's much more metropolitan. Has it been a difficult process to get those programs started at Kent State and in that area?
Yeah, surprisingly not. And I remember once doing a panel with people at CLAGS, at New York University. And I think they thought that my story was going to be the one of terrible things happened.
Right.
But instead, and I think some of it is, Kent State has the legacy of the May 4th, 1970, shootings of students by the National Guard. So I think we've been a more progressive, socially minded place. So institutionally, there weren't problems. From time to time, we do get some hate mail. From time to time, we've had state legislatures that say we ought not to do it. But, our university has backed us. And, we've been getting students from all around the country. Our classes are online as well as face-to-face. Well, now they're all online this year. But normally we teach classes online as well as face-to-face, because we know there's so few programs in LGBTQ studies.
Gotcha. Involved for them.
Yeah. And the reason that myself and some others started the LGBT Center was that we realized that students needed more resources, because even though the institution was supportive, a lot of their families aren't, a lot of the local communities aren't. And so we realized that, we had an obligation. If we were going to have students get into our academic programs and they're coming out, like, we would have students whose parents would cut them off entirely. And so we established scholarships, because, we
can't believe that still.
It still happens.
I know, that's something that really breaks my heart. With all the representation, that's something that I would have hoped really would have changed.
Yeah, I would say it's gotten better, but it still sadly happens. And we've been very concerned about our students lately because of COVID, because, students are now at home, and sometimes that's the home of the oppressor. And so it's very challenging right now.
Wow. Molly, this has been so enlightening. I'm so excited. I've seen some comments of people who are going to go and pick up the book. Don't forget to pick it up. Clipped Wings, the Rise and Fall of the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II. I might want to reach out and talk about gender stuff again and LGBTQ stuff because it's fascinating. It is fascinating to me. Thanks so much for being here and stay healthy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care.
You're welcome. Bye-bye. All righty. Our next author is, my next guest is Joan Thomas, whose fourth novel, Five Wives, won Canada's most prestigious Governor General's Award for fiction. Her three previous novels have been praised for their intimate and insightful depictions of characters in times of rapid social change. Reading by Lightning, set in World War II, Curiosity, based on the life of pre-Darwinist fossilist Mary Anning, and The Opening Sky, a novel about a family navigating contemporary crisis. Please welcome Joan Thomas.
Hi.
Joan,
hi.
Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be on your show.
Oh, you're so welcome. Are you coming to me from Canada today?
I sure am. Lots of snow out the window.
Oh, is there? Nice. We had a little
yeah.
yesterday, but it melted.
Yeah, actually, I'm in Winnipeg and it's minus 30 today. So
it's cold here, but I can't complain because it's not that. It's definitely not that. This is your fourth novel, which is a fictionalized account of how evangelicals descended on the, am I going to pronounce this right, Guarani?
Yes.
An Ecuadorian indigenous community, devastating their culture and lives, affecting the women who were left behind, their struggles with grief, with doubt, and with each other. What led you to write about these women?
Well, I knew this story very well as a young person. And I think that tells you how big it was because I grew up on the Canadian prairies, and this is an American story. It's about U.S. families who moved to Ecuador, but it's one of the sort of famous missionary stories that I think anybody who grew up in an evangelical church will know about. It's not a spoiler to say that all five men in these families were killed by the Guarani people, and they became heroes and martyrs to the evangelical church. And
in 1956, right? They were killed in
1956. Yeah. And I was drawn back into the story maybe 10 years ago when I started reading about the politics of oil in Ecuador, because the missionaries were very instrumental in kind of paving the way for the oil companies to go in. And I started to read about the politics of oil, and then I wanted to connect the dots. I wanted to see whether these indigenous people fighting to have their land cleaned up after it had been more or less destroyed by Shell Oil and Chevron, whether they had any connection to the people I knew about as a young person. And I found that indeed they did. And then I wanted to go back and look at this story from a, more mature and secular perspective, try and understand the mindset of the people involved.
This wasn't a question I had written out, but are you a religious person yourself?
Well, I grew up in a very devout evangelical home, but I kind of, moved away from that when I was in my 20s, and began, I suppose, to go through almost a process of deconstruction and try and take a look at the way I had been raised and understand it in a wider context.
And what was like one of the first things you did to sort of research the story, the women or the men who died?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of books written about this event. And one of the wives wrote a memoir called Through Gates of Splendor that has sold 500,000 copies. It's huge. It's never been out of print. It's still selling. If you go to Goodreads, people are still reading and devouring this book. So
from what year, if it's never been out of print since, do you know how long?
She wrote it the year after the man died. She wrote it in 1957.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, it's moved from, I think it's had about 6 different publishers, but anytime it fell out of print.
That's incredible, isn't that? I mean, are there a lot of books like that? I don't know. But that sounds pretty impressive to me.
Yeah. And, a lot of people really revere her perspective on this story. But, she wrote it when she was very young and right after the killings. And I was just interested in seeing what else I could see there. And so I did a lot of other research, and I went to Ecuador twice and visited the settings and talked to contemporary missionaries, talked to Indigenous people, and just kind of brought a different lens to what happened.
I mean, I was going to ask you, but I'm glad to hear. I assumed in writing something like this, you kind of had to have gone there. And have you met some of that particular tribe?
Yes. But my novel does not set out to tell the story from their perspective, which
it's the women's, yeah.
Yeah,
right?
it would be fantastic to have the story from their perspective, but I don't think that's my story to write. I didn't feel that I could do it justice, or that I was, I sort of believe in narrative sovereignty for these Indigenous people, and I wasn't going to be trying to tell their story. But I felt that I did know that the perspective of the missionaries, and I set out in this book not to sort of, debunk in a harsh way what they did, because I understand that mindset. I grew up in it. And so I wanted to explore it with some sympathy and sort of try and capture the cognitive dissonance they must have felt, because everybody around them was telling them it's crazy to try and approach these people. The Waorani were very, very known for killing anybody that entered their territory, but the missionaries were kind of very driven, and they felt God was leading them to do this, and that God would totally protect them. And then, of course, all 5 men were killed, and so they had to deal with that. And as I wrote it, it became a very timely story, because we're kind of looking at people right now in American politics in particular who see things.
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, we're fascinated in Canada, I gotta say.
I have a few friends over there who are fascinated.
Yeah, it's what it is to let your ideology shape all of your perceptions. I was really interested in that.
And it's so interesting, because I was just talking to Molly about her book, which is about World War II.
Yeah.
And today's International Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Right.
And here we're talking about ideology. Just interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's true. And she's talking about sort of the persistence of old narratives too, which I think interested me, because there are so many people who continue to see this story in its old terms, that the Waorani were heathen and primitive and needed to be saved by the missionaries. And I'm very interested in how it's so hard for us to move beyond certain racist ideas like that. And I'm just interested in how these narratives persist in people's minds, So I wanted to go into it from that point of view.
Interesting. Have you had reaction to it from, what kind
of? The reaction I have had actually moved and surprised and humbled me, because I've actually been invited to speak to book clubs in churches where this story is revered, and they have been amazingly open-hearted in reading this book. I think there's a desire, at least in the people I've spoken to maybe move a little bit in their understanding. Like, I remember one older woman said to me, the granddaughter in this book is just like my grandchildren. I think they're realizing that there is some movement, and they have to catch up with it a little bit, because they see the young people questioning the things that they always took for granted. So I should just say that, where my novel deals with real people and fictionalizes them, it also has a child and a grandchild of the missionaries, and I didn't use real people there. I invented fictional characters because I didn't want to go into the lives of people who are still living and so on. But I wanted to bring the story up to contemporary times to sort of look at how it looks from 2020 or so.
So this is, like I said at the intro, this is your 4th novel. Who or what inspired you to become a writer?
I didn't start writing until I was in my 50s. So I'm kind of pale for people who always wanted to write and never got around to it.
Well, I think I have a friend who is listening right now who is a writer, and I hope she's taking notes.
Yeah. Well, then I immediately wrote, 4 novels in 10 or 12 years, and they've done well.
Bravo,
So
bravo.
yeah.
Did you have a career, a different career prior?
Yeah, I taught high school English, and I worked as a book reviewer. So I was writing criticism, but I wasn't writing fiction. And then at a certain point, I just thought, well, if I'm ever going to do it, it has to be now. So
Good for you. I mean, second, I love it. Love it,
yeah.
really.
Well, it's been fantastic. Like, 2 of my books have been based on historical events, and so that I just love the research. That the book I wrote about Mary Anning, she was a fossilist before Charles Darwin, and she was unearthing massive marine reptile fossils on the Dorset coast in England, and nobody knew what they were. They thought they were dragons, So that was a fantastic experience to go to England and do the research and learn. I had no background in science, kind of learn about that whole mindset as well. I'm a big fan of writing from real events, writing fiction.
I think they're the most interesting in so many ways, in a lot of ways, because, and that's interesting because I didn't grow up, I am the child of 2 Holocaust survivors, and it took me a long time to understand what they had lived through, and history was never my thing. And I don't know if I was blocking that out when I was younger in school, but now I'm fascinated, and especially like you're talking about what's going on here in the United States. Like there's just a lot you can learn from these, real life events, really, because as the saying goes, history sometimes does repeat itself, and we don't want it to in many ways.
Well, it's true. Like I'm never drawn to a historical subject because I think that I can recreate that historical period and let people know what it was like. I'm drawn to them because of what they say about our times, I think. That's the bridge that interests me.
Well, they connect, the connection.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
How did it feel? You won the award, the Commonwealth Prize for Best First Book in 2008 when that book came out. I mean, that must have been something. That must have felt great.
It was fantastic. There were 4 areas in the British Commonwealth at that time, and so they brought all 4 winners to New Zealand for the Auckland.
So sorry. So sorry.
And I was brand new to the whole world of doing public readings and doing interviews, and it was such a my book wasn't even for sale in New Zealand, but I was on all these TV shows. And so I had this training where nobody I knew could ever see me, it was kind of cool, but it was huge. It was a real gift.
and not a bad trip either, huh?
No, that's right. And this last book that won the Governor General, so she's the Queen's representative in Canada, and so that ceremony was in Rideau Hall, which is this palatial place. It was really a lovely gift to be able to go there, and I guess I feel especially lucky because it came out just before the pandemic, and I would have missed all of that opportunity.
Oh, the travel, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's right.
What you've always wanted to write. You wrote later in life. Reading by Lightning is the story of a young woman developing a sense of herself during the Depression and World War II. How did you make that decision that would be your first book?
Well, I went to family stories, as I think so many people do when they start writing. And I had an aunt who had been sent by her father back to England during World War II to look after his mother. And she had never been off their little farm in the prairies. She was 16 years old. She took the train across Canada, took a ship on her own. I was so fascinated by that story. And so I kind of moved into that family story. I mean, she had never told me very many details about it, but that left me room to imagine. So I think a lot of people start with material like that's close to home.
I guess things that they know or stories you hear. Do you have a 5th in mind?
I'm about 200 pages into a contemporary novel set in Canada not based on any real story, much harder to invent everything. It's kind of easier to do research, but I have 4 characters in mind, and I want to look at the psychic burden of climate change and how we are navigating that as a culture. So, I mean, I'm kind of pairing my story open to tell you the theme, and I think when people read it, I'm not sure they'll get right away that that's what it is. It's a book about character and events between them, but at heart, that's what is my driving motive, I would say. So I like to take on big subjects, apparently.
Definitely.
It's a hard one.
You said you wrote later in life, but did you write along the way? Like, were there things short stories or?
I didn't write fiction. I journaled, and I wrote. Okay. And I wrote book reviews. And then at a certain point, I left teaching and I worked for the Department of Ed as a technical writer, writing curriculum. So, I was kind of used to the craft of writing. Yeah. And book reviewing is a real good apprenticeship for writing fiction, because as a reader, you really pay attention. You really think about how novels work. And you're used to you're used to an 800-word limit, and so every sentence has to be rich and every sentence has to count. I think it helped me as a writer.
Do you have any idea how many books you read to review?
I think I wrote about 200 book reviews.
Wow.
So,
would you be able to pick out of those 200 a favorite? A favorite book, not necessarily your review.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Early on, I reviewed some Margaret Atwood, and she blows me away. As a Canadian writer, I just love the mordant humor in her work. It's very edgy. She was a huge model for me. So I might say Margaret Atwood. And another Canadian writer that's had a big impact on me is Miriam Chaves. I don't know if her books are known in the States as well, but she's from the same part of Canada that I am, and she tends to write about, her background is Mennonite, so she tends to write about a social context similar to the one I grew up in, and very smart and funny writing too. So those would be two names.
It's always great to hear, who influenced another writer and why. I think people like to hear those things. Yeah. Well, Joan, thank you so much for spending time with me.
Well,
I hope everyone goes out and picks up 5 Wives. Please do so.
Well, and if they do, they can contact me through my website if they have any questions.
Oh, great.
That'd be great.
And there's the website, right?
Happy to have a dialogue with them. So, yeah.
Oh, that's great. I love that you do that. Have a great day and stay safe. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for this.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You too. All righty. Now, my next guest, sorry about that, guys. My next guest and last one up today is Susan Rubin, who wrote the trippy time travel fantasy, The Road Not Taken, which is her first novel. Susan has been writing and producing plays for over 20 years. Her work has been performed in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Baltimore, and Cuba. And her works have been produced at the New York Theater Workshop, Baltimore Center Stage, the Los Angeles Theater Center, where she was in residence for 6 years. Susan has written for Funny or Die, and in stark contrast, she's written some 25 documentaries that highlighted international women's issues like domestic violence, forced child marriage, and untested rape kits accumulating in police evidence rooms around the country. Susan has used her skill, empathy, and compassion to render these darkest of topics into accessible films distributed to tens of thousands of college classrooms. It is my pleasure to welcome Susan Rubin to the Locher Room. Susan, how are you, Susan?
I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for being here.
I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you are. So tell us, this is your first novel after years as a playwright, actor, documentarian, blogger, sketch writer, cabaret performer, and now you decide to write your first novel. Can you tell us why?
A couple of reasons. The documentary writing had ended because I wrote for Ms. Magazine's mother organization, the Feminist Majority, and they weren't going to. We were sending all of our documentaries to graduate students and to college students by then, and we had covered the territory pretty well. You mentioned it: domestic violence, campus rape. It was not fun. And I would alternate every year with doing a play so that I could do a documentary and spend my time smashing my head on my desk crying, and then with my partner, because we used UNICEF footage. I don't know. I have some funny stories about. The funniest story is that Carrie Fisher. I started to narrate the documentaries after Carrie Fisher wouldn't say UNICEF. I don't know why she wouldn't say it. She was afraid she was going to get it wrong. And I said, how can you just say UNICEF? And she said, I'm not going to say
She had a mental block.
She had a mental block. And I said, but you just said UNICEF. And she said, I'm not saying it. So we dubbed me in for that. And after that, I was the writer and the narrator. And it's very immersive. Excuse me, I have LA throat.
Oh, don't worry.
It was so dark and so necessary because I didn't know I didn't know anything about what I wrote about until I had to really research it. And then so I would alternate. I'm sorry you can hear that, but
That's okay. It happens.
Okay. So I alternated every year. I would do a documentary and then I would do a play, and the play was allowed to be about and I had done cabaret for years, which was really fun. Cabaret,
Oh yeah, I love cabaret.
I love cabaret, and we had taken a cabaret show. I had, this is not going to be so funny, but I'll make it funny. I had cancer when I was 30.
Oh, that's not funny.
No, but it was funny because I got cured, and then I wrote a play called Life and Death, the Vaudeville Show, and we took it to Cuba. Because in those days, Cuba could only invite you in if you could be part of a performance festival. So we did this play in English. Nobody understood a word we were saying, and I think I talked to you about this. And they had no equipment, so the footlight was a flame inside a little metal flame holder. And anytime I got anywhere near it, I thought, okay, well, I'm going to die, because I tap danced in the show. I used to tap dance. Mm-hmm. So I wrote a play every year, and I tried to write. I listened to what your last wonderful guest said. I tried to write about things that I cared a lot about, but I also wrote a lot about my family, and that was fun. It was more fun than the documentaries, but I would alternate a play. By the time I really hit my stride, I was writing one a year, and then Ms. asked me to blog for them, and the blogging stuff was much lighter, and I wrote about Jimmy Choo shoes and what they do to your ankle, but I made it funny, and I wrote about women paying money to revirginate themselves. I don't know if you've heard about this, as a Valentine's Day present for their boyfriend, which I thought was, oh my God. So I wrote a Funny or Die about it. 2468, let's all go revirginate. And it was, it was unbelievable. $3,500 for 2 minutes worth of somebody thinking you're a virgin, which annoyed me. And so I was really beginning to, I loved everything that I don't mean I loved everything I wrote, but I loved the work, and I loved working with people. The thing about writing a book is, by the time I stopped doing theater, the LA theater scene had changed drastically because of some equity rules that forced us in small theater to pay salaries we couldn't pay. And I was paying those salaries because I took my documentary salary and just put it into my plays so I could pay people, because I think people should be paid, but I don't think a whole theater scene should be destroyed. Not everybody had the salary I had, and I was lucky that I had the salary and could put on plays in co-production with the Los Angeles Theater Center. Gave me a 6-year free ride, and I did a lot of plays there. And then other theaters gave me residencies, so I never had to pay full tariff for the production, so I could pay the actors. So when the equity thing said you have to pay the actors, it was annoying. And then they just slammed the theater scene shut, and I thought, I'm going to go crazy because the documentaries were done, because, unless we wrote a lot.
You needed to find an outlet.
I needed to write. I
Yeah,
really
you needed an outlet. So The Road Not Taken explores through trippy fantasy a woman's tragedy-induced midlife crisis. So it involves a search for self, which is a universal topic, but you filter it through imposed restrictions about what should make one happy and the fear of making choices. Can you describe the story in your own words?
Yeah, I would say it's about a 50-year-old woman who has wasted the first 50 years of her life refusing to use her full brain. And she's I make her extremely smart because I don't like dumb people. And she is, for reasons that you'd have to go into, you can talk to my therapist later, for certain reasons, she just doesn't use her life. And at 50, her husband drops dead and he's an oncologist, very sweet man. I'm very fond of him. He never existed. And he leaves her a lot of money, and he leaves her the one child that she had because she felt, and this I do feel like, women who don't produce a child, can I say vaginally on your show? Yes, that's a technical word. Women who don't, I had raised a child in a collective who is still one of my best friends, and his mother was 17 when he was born, and a group of us got together and said, we'll raise him with you, which we did, and I'm very, very close to him. And, I felt that was mothering, and I've been, godmothers. I like to talk to younger people about, just go ahead and do it. Don't let anyone tell you to stop doing it. But I do, so my character had a child because she felt that was the only way to get a seat at the human dinner table. And she loves the child. She grows to love her more as her own life takes off. What happens is she is discovered by a group of 100 people called the Lost, who have been on the planet Earth since, for 50 million years, since the whole since the universe was created by the boson particle. I started to read astrophysics about, boom, in 1/1000th of a billionth of a second, the whole thing was created. And so they come to her. There's 100 of them. Some of them are not human animals, but they all talk. She has very long conversations with the snow leopard, which are some of my favorite stuff. But they come every 1,000 years, and they ask a human being who they think is smart, but not necessarily has used their smarts. They ask them if that human being can cast a judgment on the Earth's usability, because we're a high intensity energy planet. And so she suddenly has a goal in life, and they take her through the time-space continuum. They take her back to ancient Egypt, and she becomes involved with the 4 major mythological figures in Egypt, who are Isis, Osiris, Set, and Nephthys. They're brothers and sisters, all married to each other. That's already very complicated. And she becomes very close to Vincent Van Gogh because she walks inside one of his canvases, because she can do anything now with these sort of superhuman 50 million year old earth dwellers. She walks into Van Gogh's bedroom at Arles and meets him, and they become very close. And that's a big part of the book, is him saying to her, what's your talent? And she says, I don't have any talent. And he said, well, that's not true. Everyone has talent. And so a lot of things push her towards discovering who she is. And at the end of the book, she writes an argument for these 100 people who have been here 50 million years about what she thinks the Earth is, good and bad. And she and I don't agree. She's much nicer than I am. She thinks if people could stop being cruel, that everything would be worth it. I don't think, right now, I don't see people not being cruel. So my feeling is, I don't want to see people die, but if the boson particle in a billionth of a second could stop the cruelty, I'd vote yes. So my protagonist and I took a parting of the ways, and I still had to write her position, which was that the world is worth it, and that people are I think people are wonderful too, but I happen to prefer cats. So it was a real fantasy. She had boyfriends, like Vincent Van Gogh was not her boyfriend, but she also was standing outside his painting when he got shot. There's a whole new thing about how Vincent Van Gogh died, which is that he did not commit suicide. Do you know this old tome that they wrote? It's kind of the new information is that Vincent Van Gogh was shot accidentally by a drunken teenager who had his grandfather's pistol with him. And that's pretty much what scholars think actually happened, is that he died from this accidental gunshot wound, and he didn't want to get the kid in trouble, so he lied about it. So she goes through a lot of changes about mortality and what's important. And, you know, at the end, she makes this statement about the planet, which is just stop being so cruel, you know. And I guess that would be my statement too, is all the other problems are solvable.
Yeah, well, you talk about the election of 2016 in your blog and how the world has changed so drastically, and you believe only those who are truly dead inside don't want answers to the more serious questions we now face. Can you talk about some of those questions you're referring to and that period in our country that inspired you to write the book?
I think I started writing it right before that election. First of all, I was at the Feminist Majority on the night of election 2016, and we were all yelling, she's going to win, she's going to win. And at about 8 o'clock at night, California time, one of my colleagues tapped me and said she lost. And I said, oh no. And there was a lot of shock and awe in me. And I began to reevaluate stuff and say, you're going to end up in a nice, I wanted a peach-colored straitjacket. I've been very clear. I don't want a beige straitjacket. It doesn't go with my coloring. But I was clear that if I didn't start to write during that administration, because I really expected Hillary Clinton to do it, you know, and to whatever one thinks of her, I thought that issues for women would get, because I had been writing about this stuff, as I've said in the documentaries. The situation for women worldwide is undescribably terrible, and I'm not going to describe it because we're having a good time. But
right, and she has, you know, been fighting for women's rights for most of her career.
She has, and she also had said at the Beijing conference of 1992, she described female genital mutilation. There was a big argument about whether it was a cultural thing and we should mind our own business. And she said, it's not cultural, it's criminal. And I thought that was going to be the tone of 2016 and forward, was that we would address issues like forced child marriage, which happens in Afghanistan and a lot of countries. But in Afghanistan, you can marry a 5-year-old girl. All you have to do is promise that you won't become her husband until she's 12. And if you believe that, maybe you
excuse me.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was writing about such grim stuff worldwide, and then this very grim thing happened, and I thought, you're gonna really like end up picking up stones at the mental institution and making little sculptures. So I wanted to write something that said, it's interesting because your last guest said she didn't start to write until 50, and my protagonist is 50 when her life begins. Her husband died, and I really wanted to say to people younger than that, it doesn't matter how old you are. It matters that your soul, you know, find your talent. Because I fell for what Vincent Van Gogh said. I thought everybody does have talent. Everybody has something to contribute. And if you don't find it, what are you doing here? And find it, because it's not that hard. Once you put aside that your only job is to be a mommy, and I am a mommy. I really am one of the mommiest people I know. I like people feel free to come to me, and I like nurturing. And I'm not going to mention my cats and the fact that I breastfeed one of my cats, because that's probably just very inappropriate. But yeah. I like, but it wouldn't make up a whole lifetime for me. And I discovered after writing. I wrote for Funny or Die, as I said, a lot of stuff that I had written as serious blogs, and I was able to find the humor in it. And people really, it was on Funny or Die for 11 years. I kept checking and saying, oh my God, they're still watching this. I think it's because humor is a very important component of telling the hard truth. You really don't want to hear what I learned about early forced marriage unless I can say it to you in a way that gives you hope. And I think humor is extremely hopeful.
Humor is healing for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that,
the questions, that the election and how you felt after the election, you discuss a lot of that in a blog you created, Mapping the Road Not Taken.
Yeah.
Talk about the blog and how, sharing those questions with others. What has the response been?
My colleagues and I, who had worked on getting the book, Ms. Magazine did a lot to help the book get out. And because I had written for them for many years, they considered it, first of all, it's a book, that does include women over 50, and a lot of stuff doesn't. So
you're very popular. Your email.
It is. Really?
I hear your email. Is it your email pop? I was like, wow, you're going to have a lot of emails to read after this.
Oh, that's nice. I'm glad to hear that. So I wanted to, your question was 2016 and the blog.
Mapping the questions. You know.
Oh, I know. Okay, sorry. So we decided that there was a way to help people decide if they wanted to read the book by taking sections out of the book and writing about them in a blog instead of you have to buy the whole book. And so I wrote about her relationship with Vincent Van Gogh, and I wrote about, she has 2 cats who are in love. They talk a lot in the book. I have a lot of talking cats. I will always write. Oh, what a beautiful cover! I love that cover so much. So I wanted to do Mapping the Book about most of the issues in the book so that you could decide as a reader, wow, that's interesting. That's an interesting way to decide if I want to read the book is, do I care that she had do you care that Vincent Van Gogh made really good onion soup? I wrote a Mapping the Book about that. And I wrote a lot about the issues in the book, about what she confronted, and there's a lot of them, the Mapping the Books, and they were partly because I missed writing the book so much. I missed it when it ended, and I had a couple of friends who said I needed to go back and read it again because I missed it when it ended. Because when it ends, you're back in the world. I really take you out of the world, which is not what you do in a documentary. You really have to dig into the darkness of the world. I took people, flying through time and space. And when it ended, I wanted to explain, you want to fly through time and space. There is a time-space continuum. It's a real Albert Einstein talks about it. That's the best way to say it. Everything we've ever done is recorded and is on this thing that I picture as kind of a big CD of the whole universe. And so if you've existed, you exist on this. And I thought that was fascinating because we've all existed and we will all always exist. That's not a religious as much as a spiritual statement. If you've existed, you will continue to exist in time and space, and just, you exist. And so I started to write the Mapping the Book stuff to talk about specific stuff like that.
That's great. Do you have another novel in your mind, or have you started a follow-up?
Yeah, this is bad. Should I tell you?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was raised in a little house in Greenwich Village called a brownstone. None of them are made of brownstone. They're all made of brick. I have no idea why it's called a brownstone. But my family raised me in it. And then my mother wanted to move uptown she needed a bigger space. My mother was a fundraiser for Russian war relief, long after the Russians didn't need any war relief. She was a Russophile, which was weird because we were chased out of Russia. You said that your family were Holocaust survivors. My mother was a total Russophile, and the Russians didn't like us particularly. So my new book is about this house that I was raised in, this brownstone, because 2 men moved into the house as tenants after we moved out, and they were both murderers. And my father rented to both of them. My father was a very sweet, we call it a textile executive. It's actually, he sold men's underwear, and he sold a lot of it. He sold to J.C. Penney's and Alexander, but he rented to a man named Lucien Carr. Have you ever heard the name?
The name sounds familiar, but I don't.
car, William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg began to hang out in my house after we moved out. They were the next people to hang there.
I know those names.
That's the beat. That's the whole beat thing. And so my character, who is me, goes back and explores, why did my father rent to this guy who he had murdered a man who had been his mentor, and he murdered him, and they didn't want to charge him under a law in New York that is still on the book called gay panic. He claimed that the guy had come on to him and that he got scared and killed him. I'm not going to describe it for you. There's no way he got scared and killed him like this. This is like
interesting.
Impossible. It was a premeditated, very brutal murder. And then I was talking to one of my cousins and saying, why did my father rent to him? He must have been very charming. And there's a lot written about him. And there's a movie called Kill Your Darlings, if you want to see my house. And she said, well, he rented to William Burroughs. And I looked William Burroughs up, and he had shot his wife in the head and gotten away with it. So there were two murderers in this little house that was my home. And I had to figure out a way to say, well, what the hell was the matter with my father? Was a very sweet guy, and certainly not a sophisticate. Like, he didn't need the Beat Generation to be reading their poems in our living room. But that's what happened. They used the house because it was in the West Village, and it became the meeting place for all of them until different things happened to them. But neither Lucian Carr nor William Burroughs suffered any ill effects for having murdered someone quite deliberately. And wow. So that's what I'm writing about. I'm trying to write about the daughter's relationship to her father, letting those people live there. And then, I'm not going to tell you the turn. Then he realizes how disturbed she is by it. And he puts down the underpants he's selling and tries to deal with his daughter's heartbreak that her father, they were both very, William Burroughs and Lucian Carr were, from what I understand, very charming and very much posers. I'm a little bit snobby. I don't like intellectuals who kill people. And
yeah, I don't like anybody who kills people.
Yeah, I don't like anybody.
Whether you're smart or dumb.
Burroughs claimed that they were playing a game of William Tell, that his wife went along with it. She had her drink on her head, and he just missed and shot her through the forehead. I have a problem with that. So, the people who read the book can decide for themselves. But I've always had a problem with, I don't think your previous two guests had, maybe they did. I have a problem with institutionalized pretentiousness. There, I used a word I can get away with. I don't like institutions. And I went to college and did exactly what my character in the first book did. I did nothing. I read all the books. I could get away with murder because I'm smart enough to read a book and write an essay without having paid any attention whatsoever. So I wanted to say that about people. If you're smart and I didn't know the second act of Romeo and Juliet until I saw the movie. And then I was like, I almost had a heart attack because I thought, if you read the second half of the book, it doesn't end so good. So yeah,
that's great.
It's about these two murderers that my father found perfectly charming to rent to.
Well, I look forward to it.
I look forward to you reading it.
Good. Well, Susan, thank you so much for being here. The Road Not Taken is out. Please pick it up. You stay well. And when the next book comes out, we'll do this again.
You stay well, too. It has been really a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate it a lot.
You too. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thanks. Oops. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in today. Thank you to my first guest, Dr. Molly Merriman, author of Clipped Wings, The Rise and Fall of the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II, and Joan Thomas, the author of 5 Wives, and Susan Rubin, the author of The Road Not Taken. Have a great day, everybody, and I will see you soon.